І наступна на черзі Дарина ХАРУК, student, Адам Міцкевич University of in Poznan. Тема «Alcohol as a tool for escape, self-imposed decline of addictive character in Francis Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night».
Дякую дуже, пані Світлана. Моя доповідь англійською мовою, тому що це частина більшого проєкту, над яким я працюю англійською. Але в разі, якщо хтось буде мати запитання, то я буду рада вислухати їх українською. Регламент у нас сьогодні досить суворий, тому я перейду одразу до доповіді. As one of the brightest and most talented writers of the Lost Generation group, Francis Scott Fitzgerald was also a living legend of his time. He was one of the most celebrated figures of 1920s, and his role in depicting the atmosphere of jazz age was so vivid that I guess it would be fair to say that till now his name is strongly associated with flappers with bobbed hair, speakeasies, jazz music, and carefree life full of booze and fun. However, his role as a voice generation is justified not only by his writings, but also by lifestyle he followed. In 1920s, after the world saw his first novel, This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald basically made his American dream come true overnight. He was only 23 years old and he became extremely rich and successful. This Side of Paradise gained such popularity due to the author's ability to subtly feel and convey the mood of the times. And as a protagonist, Emery Blaine constantly feels confusion and despair because of the loss of moral guidance, which was quite typical of young people at that time. World War I completely destroyed their ideals, aspirations, hopes. Nothing was known for sure, so the whole generation was basically lost. Uncertainty about fragile future did not allow them to settle firmly in the world, so they tried to at least enjoy the present, take everything it has to offer before it slips through the fingers. And it definitely was one of the reasons why people drank so much during 20s. These dilemmas, which Fitzgerald writes about, were based not only on his observations, but also on his own experience. That's very important for us because the book we're going to be talking about today is very, very autobiographical. So coming back to This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald, just like his protagonist, Emery Blaine, he was studying at Princeton, had ambitions to become a writer and enrolled in army. What's more, the romance between characters in the book, Rosalind and Emery, they mirrored a relationship between Fitzgerald and his future wife, Zelda, in aspect that both women emphasized financial success as a necessary condition for their affair to grow into marriage. So after the publishing of this novel, Fitzgerald became one of America's most popular authors, and his stories were published in well-known magazines and newspapers. And he also became the youngest writer to work with a Scribner publishing house, which was quite luxurious. The success of This Side of Paradise is not only his starting point as a novelist, but it also marks up the beginning of a decade of careless life, full of parties and drinking, because he was extremely rich. And as we're going to be talking about, his character was quite unstable and his life conditions were quite difficult throughout all his life, actually. So being able to not care about making money basically allowed him to spend too much time drinking. It was his extraordinary success that helped him to marry Zelda Sayre, who was a little bit cautious about marrying a writer with no money, because she knew that love on budget was impossible for them. But as soon as the novel was published, Zelda gave her final consent, and they became the most scandalous couple of the time. They were rich, careless, and the best, the most beloved way of spending time for them was attending parties. they were always welcome everywhere, and they were basically legends of their times. Obviously, this lifestyle, it didn't, it had a huge influence of their future, and the consequences were very bad. Since 1925, the writer's wife suffered from mental disorders, and in 1930, she was diagnosed with incurable schizophrenia. And after that, she rarely leaves the walls of different clinics. And Fitzgerald is going through this time very, very painfully. This period can be marked as a time when he starts drinking, but not for the sake of fun, but to ease the pain of unbearable situation he found himself in. And, you know, it's a vicious cycle. The more he drinks, the more depressed he gets. It's evident that throughout his life he was an alcoholic. In A Movable Feast, Ernest Hemingway, who was also a big drunkard, he was very close with Fitzgerald at that time. And once they took a trip together, and he writes about it in his book, Movable Feast. Most of the time, he just calls him Poor Scott and describes him as a pathetic drunkard who, throughout the trip, was hardly ever sober. And he insisted all the time that he was dying. And Hemingway says, I quote, he did have a point though, and I knew it very well. Most drunkards in those days died of pneumonia, a disease which has been almost eliminated. But it was hard to accept him as a drunkard since he was affected by such small quantities of alcohol. Of course, taking into account the specific nature of Hemingway's character and the complexity of relationship between two writers, I wouldn't say that Hemingway is a trustworthy source of information. However, facts in many biographies make it clear that Fitzgerald was an alcoholic. Even during his attempt to reduce an alcohol intake, his consumption was so big that he could drink 37 bottles of beer a day. And it resulted in hospitalization in September of 1935. And after that time, he never gained health. So his drinking habits could be considered as a sign of the times, because prohibition, as many researchers say, is a failed experiment, and it had unexpected results. Instead of sobering up, Americans drank with even more preservatives, actively developing a new culture of alcohol consumption. And speakeasies and clandestine alcohol and the new invention of the time, cocktail, made drinking not just a habit, but also a tool of having as much fun as possible. So being an integral part of Fitzgerald's life, alcohol was a vital element of his works as well. And as Scott Donaldson points, I cite, Fitzgerald revealed his attitude towards drinking in his fiction. From the beginning, it was the subject he liked to write about. There are drunks or drinking bouts in all his novels. But I think that the most eloquent example of Fitzgerald's fiction centered on drinking is Tender is the Night. It's, as John Cawley calls it, it's a locus classicus of American drunk narratives. At one point, it was even called the drunkard's holiday. The years when the novel was written were very harsh for USA. It was late 20s. The era of carefree jazz and huge economic boom suddenly ended. And this sobering time allowed people to look back at their wasted years and reflect on them. And I think that Tender is the Night is basically the reflection on this time. And it's also worth mentioning that being the heir to the tradition of great American romantics, Fitzgerald depicted tragic fate of people in post-World War and the loneliness and their biggest struggles. One of them was problems with alcohol consumption. But unlike romantics, he depicts this within a framework of not only personal, but also social factors. He organically merges romantic and realistic tendencies in perception of reflecting of reality. In his writing, he raises a special aspect of American dream. It's the person who achieves it, who has everything he wanted. He is wealthy, he has family, but he's not able to keep his alcohol. And for him, it's a fatal factor. He loses his happiness. So coming back to Tender is the Night, it was published in 1934, and it took Fitzgerald 10 years to finish it, and he himself considered it the best of his novels. One of the reasons could be that the collapse of the romantic illusion and the reverse side of American Dream, which is described in this book, it would be fair to say that it reflects Fitzgerald's experience. The author describes the moral decline of the protagonist in a very unapparent way, so it's difficult to trace its course and to capture a moment when everything that Dick, his protagonist, Dick Diver, dreamed of and worked on is lost forever. At the beginning of the novel, our author introduces us to a young, talented psychiatrist with excellent physical and mental health, who never gets drunk. And it's very important because everyone around him once in a while gets drunk. While Dick, he could have a glass of champagne and that would be it. He was just charming. And he was not just talented, he was also hardworking and focused on achieving of his success. And his ambitions were so high that his goal was to become the best psychiatrist in the world. Because of the retrospective narration, it's difficult for reader to understand the nature of his character. But as the story unfolds, we learn more and more about him. And one of the most important things we learn is that his wife, Nicole, she's suffering from consequences of severe psychological trauma caused by sexual abuse inflicted by her father when she was a young girl. And due to this specific nature of their relationship, when Dick is a psychiatrist and she's suffering from mental illness, he is portrayed not only as a husband, but as a doctor. Ethical views of Dr. Diver were very noble. But once again, as the story unfolds, he drifts farther and farther from his ideals. The obvious reason could be that his marriage was very troublesome, and he was a good specialist in his field, so he was doubting before marrying Nicole, and his colleagues were warning him, but even Nicole's family was warning him, actually, but he ignored it. Obviously, he couldn't evaluate the situation soberly because her feelings for Nicole were very sincere, but his problem was that he was so self-confident, and he believed that he could withstand the struggle with his wife's illness. Another potential...
Прошу вас переходити до висновків і потроху завершувати. І якщо можна, на кінець там стисло одним реченням висновок вашої роботи для тих, хто, можливо, не знайомий з англійською мовою. Прошу.
Окей, добре. So, being under pressure of all the struggles, Dick Diver began to seek relief in wine. And unable to come to terms with the situation he is in, he saw only one way out to break this vicious cycle by withdrawing himself from what he used to have. As Roger Forstead says, the crucial instrument of Dick's disintegration is alcohol that runs through the novel. He changes from a normal, careful drinker to careless, often secret abuser. Of course, it would be naive to say that all his problems were caused by alcoholism, as Fitzgerald himself wrote once, that the assumption that all my troubles are due to drink is a little too easy. But there is no way to escape the fact alcohol tragically exacerbated our already bad situation. So, summing up, the addiction broke the identity of the young doctor, even those of the actions that gave him the fulfillment, like practicing medicine, writing scientific papers, gradually lose their meaning and hence social function. His dream of a family and a favorite job has been ruined, And we are witnessing a downfall of a man who becomes an uncontrollable drunk and breaks under the pressure of this awful sickness. Отже, в моїй роботі йдеться про те, що це аналіз одного з романів Френсіса Скотта Фіцджеральда. Він автобіографічний, тому я на початку говорила більше про самого автора. Між автором і його головним героєм є одна дуже схожа річ – це способи споживання алкоголю. Вони дуже схожі, якщо не сказати ідентичні. І у автора, і у його героя це споживання алкоголю привело до, на жаль, дуже негативних наслідків. Це якщо коротко.